everyone. My name is Cindy Stover, and I am a justice mobilizer for the Christian Reformed Church. And I'm here talking with Joseph and JJ, and we're wanting to talk a little bit about how refugees around the world are impacted, particularly right now during the coronavirus pandemic. So we're going to have a little conversation about how the people that Joseph and JJ support are being challenged, but also how there is hope in their situations. So Joseph and JJ, can you introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Cindy. My name is Joseph Mutebi. I work for World Renew for the last 12 years in Uganda. I'm based in Northern Uganda, working with the South Sudanese refugees that came in Northern Uganda since 2016.
And my name is JJ TenClay. I've worked for the last 6 years for RCA Global Mission. I spent 4 years in Italy working with migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and survivors of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. And I now work as the Refugee Ministries Coordinator.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here and sharing with us. So we prepared a few questions beforehand. So I'm going to start with Joseph. What is the reality that refugees face where you are in Northern Uganda and in the surrounding region? And how does the current pandemic affect their situations?
This posed overwhelming needs for safety for women, children, and the elderly. And also we see a lot of ethnic violence, the depletion of the environment because of the multitude of so many refugees. Of course, conflict over the natural resources happening when there are too many people in one place, and also inadequate livelihood sources in a foreign land. Even if they come with the skills, they don't have the opening for them to be able to utilize them. Of course, there is lack of adequate farmland for agriculture, and where it's available that is provided for them, the land is not so good. And as a result of this, we see increased violence cases as of now during the pandemic, because most of the people are at home, they are restricted their movements, and therefore we also find that there is limited or thin staff of agencies that would be supporting on the ground because of the pandemic. And of course, we find that one of the other challenges is the extended dry season, that has delayed the crop season that the farmers would have expected to have enough food for which they could access food. So these are some of the challenges as a result of the pandemic.
JJ, you have experience in the Mediterranean region. What is the reality that refugees face in that area, and how is the pandemic affecting them?
So most of the migrants and refugees I worked with in the Mediterranean area come from various parts of Africa and the Middle East. They left their homes due to war and violent conflict, terrorism, persecution, political and economic instability, famine, droughts, natural and man-made disasters, climate change, and of course, severe and pervasive poverty. These things don't stop because there's a global pandemic such as COVID-19. In fact, it only complicates things. It's very difficult to maintain personal hygiene and physical distancing from others while on a migration journey. And their migration journey often stops in Libya before crossing the Mediterranean Sea. Libya is a very dangerous place for migrants and refugees. It's even more dangerous now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as there's armed conflict that continues in Libya, food prices are soaring, and refugees are facing increased evictions from landlords, or they're being held in makeshift prisons and detention centers manned by armed militias. Refugees continue to be exploited by traffickers and armed militias, and they and their families at home are being financially extorted. Many migrants and refugees work in agriculture, food processing, or other jobs where it's hard to protect themselves from COVID-19. And studies show that 75% of migrants and refugees in Libya have lost their jobs in March and April due to lockdown procedures. Despite lockdown procedures, however, the number of departures of migrants and refugees from the Libyan coast have quadrupled in this time period from last year. The Mediterranean Sea migration route is considered to be the deadliest migration route in the world, and it just became more deadly as the two non-governmental organization rescue boats that were still in operation last month have been grounded by the Italian government in an ongoing battle between international human rights laws and regional compacts and accords. Most migrants and refugees are set out to sea on old fishing boats or rubber dinghies without adequate food, water, or life vests, and most of these boats do not make it to shore by themselves. They need rescue operations. There's also a push to return rescued migrants and refugees to Libya, where their trauma and exploitation starts all over again.
Okay, thanks for sharing. Joseph, you specifically talked about the experience of women and girls as refugees. What particularly impacts women and girls in their refugee experience? And what was it like before and then now during the pandemic? And what is World Renew doing specifically to support them?
World Renew is working with one of the biggest settlements in Uganda, that is Bidi Bidi, and Bidi Bidi has over 400,000 refugees, and it's one of the biggest settlements in the world, refugee settlement in the world. And this settlement where we are working, we are having over 80% of the population women and children, and these are South Sudan refugees, and they're living in a radius of 20 kilometers, wherever you get. Consequently, because of this, the question is, where are the men? The men are held up in the fighting, in the violence back home in South Sudan. And that disconnect, because of the pandemic, of course, affects how the functioning of the households in the settlement. And where the men are back in the households and there are multiple women that they're engaged with, then there is a challenge. There is also a cultural influence. The burden of responsibility and care of the family is upon the woman. That is in the traditional cultural practice of the South Sudanese refugees. That affects the relationship at household level. And then also we see increased exposure to higher levels of vulnerabilities. And then also we are experiencing lack of safety nets or measures by government to absorb the shocks like such as COVID-19. These affect the livelihood of the most vulnerable, that's the women, children, and also the elderly.
And what are the particular programs that World Renew is running to support them?
One of the key things that we noted right at the onset of the influx of the South Sudanese in 2016 was that there was lack of shelter and pit latrines, both at communal and individual households. They didn't have shelter, they didn't have pit latrines. That could have caused a huge impact on the livelihoods if we didn't intervene. So we provided over 1,000 pit latrines to the PSNs. The PSNs are the persons with special needs, and these include the pregnant women, all those that cannot be able to get down into the pit latrine and excavate it using hose and bunkers and machetes, but also the PSNs, the children, the child-headed households or the unaccompanied minors didn't have the opportunity, couldn't be able to excavate their own pit latrines, and therefore we provided hygiene promotion and safety for their needs. We've built also support structures in terms of trauma healing and peace building. Due to the lack or loss of property and relatives, there is trauma that was prevalent. There were cases that we would be able to see, and therefore we initiated the trauma healing and peace building. And with this, we started identifying and orienting the refugee welfare committees. And through those, we are able to identify the training of trainers from within the communities because they have the good rapport and contact with the people that they're working with. We also noted that it's important to form the peace building support groups that the structures within the communities can support themselves. And of course, that has been very helpful. And then the peace building and trauma healing support groups have been helpful. And then we see this as a springboard that we can get into rehabilitation and development for self-sustainability of the refugees.
That sounds great. Thank you. JJ, we were also talking a little bit about trauma and what maybe what people need to understand about trauma and instability as part of the refugee journey. We were talking about how that was something that, you know, is already a large part of the journey of migrants as they are leaving unstable places and seeking safety. But how has that also been amplified now during the pandemic?
I think there's four things that are important for us to understand when we're talking about the trauma that migrants and displaced people experience. The first is that reasons people flee their homes seeking refuge are traumatic and complex. And the labels we use, such as economic migrant, asylum seeker, or refugee claimant, internally displaced person, or refugee, are man-made labels that do not fully reveal the image of God in the lives of those seeking refuge. For many, the migration journey is equally traumatizing, if not more traumatizing, than the reasons for which someone flees their home to begin with. Some of the realities of migration and forced displacement include lack of resources, food, water, sanitation, medical care, lack of education and gainful employment, increased violence, trafficking and exploitation, detention and imprisonment, family separation, statelessness, trauma and complex PTSD, and death, way too much death on the migration journey. All of these things increase in the midst of a global pandemic such as COVID-19. And I would like to add that less than 1% of refugees worldwide are formally resettled in a participating refugee resettlement country like Canada or the United States. And the average time frame of displacement is 20 years. As we now know, with COVID-19, pretty much all refugee resettlement programs are at a standstill, and we have no idea when they will start again. So that also sets this time frame back. And one thing that we know is the longer people are forcibly displaced from their homes, the harder it is to ever consider returning them and having people resettle back in their home countries. We often think of migration and forced displacement as a one-time experience. Someone flees their home, they embark on one migration journey, and then they arrive in a safe place to set down roots and rebuild their lives. For many, however, that's not the case. Many continue to migrate from location to location in continuous search of fulfilling their basic needs and finding a place that is truly welcome. And in the midst of a global pandemic such as COVID-19, mistrust and xenophobia, fear of the other, increases. And so it's really hard for people to find a place to seek refuge, a place that truly is welcoming, where they can in fact have all their basic needs met, as well as their hopes and dreams, not only for themselves, but for their children, and to be able to heal and rebuild their lives after such traumatic events. And then finally, I would say many refugees long for healing in their home countries and want to return home. Refugees can be thankful to their host countries for providing protection and still hope to one day return home. This doesn't make them ungrateful, it just makes them human.